It is October 19th, 2024. And as we're continuing to keep an eye on the latest coming out of the Middle East, as well as the latest coming out of the ongoing war in Ukraine, we're also still keeping an eye on the latest tensions involving China and, of course, Taiwan. Now, this week, as you may have heard, China launched massive military drills all around Taiwan Island. And it was interesting to see the way that they were presented in the mainstream media, right? They were saying that this was an attempted message from Beijing, that it was aimed at demonstrating China's potential to choke Taiwan's access of food and fuel and block the skies and waters from which the US and its allies would presumably approach and coming to what they said was Taiwan's defense. Yeah, I guess that's one way to describe it when the US has been the one interfering, arming Taiwan to the teeth, and also getting in the ear of Taiwan's new president, as he gave a speech last week in which he claimed that he would, quote, uphold the commitment to resist annexation or encroachment upon Taiwan's sovereignty. He also said that he wanted to stand side by side with democratic countries. Now, that rhetoric is incredibly inflammatory, as is seen by Beijing amid this ongoing conflict. You have Taiwan cozying up to the US more and more. And you also have the US with its eyes on a possible war with China. Now, we know that that wouldn't start with the US just going directly to war against China. That would start with their proxies, in this case, over in Taiwan, playing the main role. And then it would continue to expand from there, which is exactly what we have seen over in Ukraine. You now have the US in a position where it is just steps away from World War III against Russia. And yet it continues on. Its neocons continue with the increasing of tensions all around the world. So, where do things go from here when it comes to China and Taiwan and where those tensions stand? Well, we got into all of the latest with a special guest earlier. So, let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is KJ Noh, a journalist, political analyst, and co host of the China Report on Breakthrough News. KJ, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure to be with you.
Always good to get to talk to you. And I want to get your take on the latest here because I know that the Chinese military conducted large scale military drills around the island of Taiwan this week. And you had the New York Times describing these drills as being aimed at demonstrating Beijing's potential to choke Taiwan's access to food and fuel and block the skies and waters from which the US and its allies would presumably approach in coming to the quote unquote island's defense. Now, the Chinese military previously said that the drills were meant to serve as a stern deterrence to the separatist acts of Taiwan independence forces. So, how do you view the timing and the significance of these drills?
Well, the timing is definitely connected to Lai Ching-te, the current president of Taiwan's statements that he made around the relationship. He seemed to make a very strong statement that Taiwan was already, quote unquote, independent, de facto independent. He considered both China and Taiwan island, which is really a province of China, to be equals. And then he also made some pretty, I would say, offensive remarks, reminding China what to do in the foreign policy area, that it needed to get in line with US standards and expectations regarding Ukraine and the Middle East, etc. So all of this is just kind of an escalation of the very, very poor relations that have been building up since the DPP took power in 2016 and have had, continued in this, post-election season. But if it's okay with you, I just kind of like to, give you an overview of what the Taiwan situation is really about.
Sure.
Yeah. So, just to give you a little anecdote, I met an American a while back and he lived on Taiwan back in the 70s. And, he said to me, Taiwan's a cool place. Why doesn't China just leave them alone? Let them do their own thing. And so I asked him, what were you doing there in that time? And he said, well, I was stationed there.
Ah.
And I said, the reason why China can't let them do their own thing is because you were there. You were a military, officer there, and the U.S. used Taiwan as a strategic base against China. They used to refer it as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, but it's actually an unsinkable nuclear submarine because it was used to store and to position strategic weapons. They had nukes on the island. And so essentially it all boils down to geography and geostrategics. I mean, people talk about economics and semiconductors and, history and culture. I mean, all of that is part of the picture. But the real thing that it has to do with is geography. Taiwan is so close to China. The main island itself is less than 100 miles. But you can't think of Taiwan as just being one big island. It's actually an island chain. It's about 130 islands, and some of them are very, very close to China. They're actually inside China's territorial waters. So if you can imagine something like, that, Cuba from Florida is the same distance as Taiwan from China. If you can imagine that Cuba did not simply, have, for example, weapons on Cuba, but that it also had control of, Key West. That's really what it is. And so, historically, all seaborne attacks on China come from Taiwan or Korea, usually at the same time. It's like Ukraine, all Western attacks on Russia go through Ukraine. All attacks on Taiwan have gone through, on China have gone through Taiwan. And this has been the case for 600 years. And then the other piece, I think, which is important to understand, this is the historical piece, is that it's a bit like, there was a civil war. The PLA beat the KMT, and the KMT retreated to both Myanmar and Taiwan, and they waged active war from Taiwan Island actually for years. I mean, shelling from Jinmen Island continued into the late 1970s, if you can believe that. And so it's a very, very important piece. That strategic piece is something we cannot ignore. The U.S. has, always used it either as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, as a military outpost, or it has used it as a hedge. And now it's gone from a hedge back into a military outpost. We literally have U.S. special warfare troops on the island, and we are, weaponizing it to the hilt. We are Ukrainizing it, and we're currently auditing and micromanaging the military in preparation for war. And so it functions a little bit like the Israel of East Asia. And so that's why it's so, why the Chinese take such exception to it.
Okay. And I really appreciate that explanation there because, yeah, I think that sometimes Americans can try to simplify it and be like, oh, it's just an island where, oh, we really value the semiconductor chips and, looking at just the economic aspect of it. But when it comes down to it, exactly as you're noting there, I mean, you have the US arming Taiwan to the teeth. And then you have this new president who comes in. He gave a speech last week in which he vowed to, quote, uphold the commitment to resist annexation or encroachment upon Taiwan's sovereignty. And he stated that his mission was to, quote, stand side by side with democratic countries. Now, I want to know how you view his speech. Does it seem like he's sending a message to both Beijing and Washington with this incredibly inflammatory rhetoric that he's using?
Yeah, certainly he's sending a message to Beijing. Is he sending a message to Washington? I think that speech was significantly written by Washington. It's essentially the State Department line, democracies versus autocracies. China should essentially fall in line with the U.S. Foreign policy objectives. And so I think it was incredibly provocative. It's inflammatory, the language that he used. And my strong feeling is that he was prompted or directed to use that language. If not, if it wasn't outright written for him. The domestic stuff, that's his own administration wrote that. But the foreign policy stuff, that is Washington speak, and he's just repeating it. So he's really pulling a Zelensky here, and it is very, very inflammatory. I think that it just simply highlights how much of a quisling government the current administration is. That is to say, his vice president is actually a deep state, factotum. She was in the Washington neocon circuit for decades. She's actually from New Jersey. She's former American citizen from New Jersey. So I think that gives you a sense of how close that relationship is. And of course, both the DPP is very, very closely tied to the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, which is essentially a regime change arm of the CIA. And they celebrate, the NED and the National Democratic Institution. So they're so deeply, deeply enmeshed in bed with the United States that it's understandable why China would be so upset. It's essentially when they say that they want to keep their independence, that's like your teenage child saying that they're independent, except that they have gotten themselves a pimp. That's about as independent as they are. That pimp, pardon my language, is the USA.
Oh, absolutely. And the US loves being the pimp for a number of different countries and states and even self governing islands in this case. And I also thought it was notable you had China's Taiwan Affairs Office release a statement in which it said that Beijing will not reject the possibility of using force over Taiwan if it, quote, dares to take risk and declare independence. However, it would be directed at outside interference and a small minority of separatists. Now, I think we all know who the outside interference is. We've been talking about it through this entire conversation. But while Beijing is listening to what Washington is saying, do you think that Washington is listening to what Beijing is saying and actually paying attention to the severity of Beijing's statements here?
I would like to say yes, but I honestly don't think so. I really don't think they're listening, just as they were not listening to Russia, as they were not listening to, Palestine or Iran. I really don't feel that, the messages are getting through. I feel like parties are talking past each other, and we see continued escalation. If we want to pinpoint the real kind of turning point of the escalation is when the US passed the Taiwan Enhanced Resiliency Act inside the NDAA. That was essentially, I'm not exaggerating, that was a declaration of war against China using Taiwan Island. It involves the permanent stationing of US troops on Taiwan Island. Just put the shoe on the other foot. Imagine if China were to put PLA troops on Galveston Island or Key West or any of the Farallon Islands. How would that be perceived? And if China were funding separatists inside of Florida or Texas, what message would that send? Well, that is exactly the message that the Taiwan Enhanced Resiliency Act sent. Before, it was all kind of gray zone strategic ambiguity. After terror passed, it was essentially, we're going to do this. we are going to create the conditions that will escalate the country to war. I think the other thing that really I think we need to understand here, I said that Taiwan Island has functioned as the Israel of East Asia. And I'm not exaggerating here. Taiwan has always had close relations with Israel. And for a long time, Israel, Taiwan, and South Africa were kind of an alliance of rogue states. And they were subcontractors for US dirty wars and US dirty work, including Iran Contra. I don't know if you remember, but the CIA's airplane, Air America, was actually maintained and run out of Taiwan, and it was actually Taiwan's international carrier. That's how close they were. And we can also think of the very recent pager attack in Lebanon. Now, Taiwan said that they didn't do it. They said they just simply licensed their brand. Apollo Gold, the pager maker, said they licensed their brand to another company that built the explosive pagers. But the question that has to be asked is, who licenses their brand to a completely unknown company that has never made anything before? I mean, McDonald's, when it, does a franchise, which is essentially a license, they make everybody use standardized equipment. You go to McDonald's University, et cetera, et cetera. There's tremendous control. And I assure you, a hamburger is much easier to make than a pager, right? We can all make hamburgers. I don't know that most people can build a pager and mass produce them and build them skillfully enough to hide explosives inside them. So essentially, the question that we have to ask here is, what did Taiwan do and how did it do it and how did it collaborate with Israel? That is a really, really important question. And it signals the fact that Taiwan really is part of an alliance of US proxies that are very, very, aggressive in the implementation of both, outright war and, gray zone war. And I think, this is one of the reasons why China will not renounce force against Taiwan Island and the Taiwan authorities. That is to say, they don't want to hurt the Taiwan people. They consider them compatriots, which is why they're always rescuing them out of war zones. All the people evacuated out of Lebanon, the Taiwan compatriots, were evacuated by the Chinese government. But they want to send a message to the DPP and their separatists that you will not get away with this kind of mischief. You've done a lot of mischief in the past. You're doing it around the world, but we will not tolerate it. I think that's the message.
Yeah, that's crazy. I did not know that about the Israel-Taiwan kind of alliance that they've had over the years, or I guess friendly ties that they've had. That's kind of fascinating when you look at the US and really what it breeds, right? The product of US foreign policy. We talk about the destruction, but it's also important to talk about the rogue states out there and of course the crimes that they commit in relation to Israel, certainly. And I was also curious too, because the US is never silent, right? They always have something to say. And this week, when it comes to their something to say, you have the US representative to NATO accusing China of quote unquote picking a side in the war in Ukraine, saying that Beijing has, quote, put its thumb on the scale and it has opted to support Russia. Now, China has maintained its neutrality. It has been pushing for peace. It has been one of the first countries to really say, hey, we've got a possible peace plan. Let's look at this. We should consider all options and have talks. But what do you make of this statement? And, sometimes I look at it and I think, so what if Beijing actually does support Moscow? I mean, these are two countries. They have close ties. They're both facing tensions and interference with the US. So what's wrong with a possible partnership between the two of them? What's your take on this one?
Well, I mean, it's exactly the same as your take. I mean, China and Russia have thousands of miles of borders. They're literally back to back against each other, and they're both targets of US aggression. The US has a plan to strategically destroy Russia through the Ukraine war. That was the plan. They were going to bleed Russia out and give it a strategic defeat. And the same plan is also the case for China. They essentially want to take China down, which is why they're encircling China with bases and preparing for war and weaponizing Taiwan and Korea and the South China Sea. And, if you don't understand that, then you have to ask yourself the very, very tough question. How did China get to put its country so close to our bases, right? So clearly the plan is to strategically destroy both China and Russia. And originally the plan as they mapped it out was that Russia, because it's simply a gas station masquerading as a country, that was just going to be an appetizer on the way to the main dish, which was China. Now it turns out that the appetizer is flounder, and they're starting to choke on the bones. And so that might move into a different direction. But what the US did was the US pushed China and Russia together. They did a reverse Kissinger. They grouped them together in the national security strategy and national defense strategy, the 2+3 formula, the two revisionist powers meaning the great enemies, and then the three inconsequential enemies that we'll just swat around anytime we feel like it. And so they pushed Russia and China together. Are you surprised that they are having relations with each other? Now, China, according to its own statements, is not providing Russia any weapons. The US is complaining that they're providing Russia with dual use components, but dual use means everything is dual use. I can use a pen to write a letter or stab myself. It's everything at the end of the day is dual use. And the other thing that they won't acknowledge is that China is also providing weapons or dual use weapons to Ukraine. So they're helping both sides. For example, most of the drones and drone components come directly out of, Chinese, corporations. So China says that we are just having normal trade relations, as most of the world, I think 150 countries are having normal trade relations with Russia. But the US is singling out China and saying that China is supporting Russia. It's just more rhetoric, more demonization. It wants to justify and exaggerate that China is a threat to us, just as Russia has been a threat to us. It's not, but it's untrue.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me to see how the US puts out those warnings because they know that much smaller countries are going to look at this situation and go, well, wait a second. I also do trade with Russia. Should I be concerned if the US is targeting China? How much easily could it be targeting me? Now, the last thing that I wanted to ask you about was kind of another element to this, and it also involves Russia and also Ukraine because you have Zelensky. He always has something to say as well. He has to get his comments in. And now he's claiming that North Korea has been supplying Russia with both weapons and soldiers. Now, even NATO's new chief, Mark Rutte, who has basically made support for Ukraine his entire personality, he has claimed that he can't confirm these reports. And then he just went into a rant about how, Russia and North Korea are too close. I don't know what he thinks NATO is supposed to do about that. But when it comes to Zelensky's claim that North Korean men are on the battlefield on Russia's side, how do you see his comments? Is he just trying to kind of get his name into the news cycle and be a part of the ongoing conversations, or is there more to it?
He's trying to get his name into the news cycle, definitely. He's trying to use some very, very familiar tropes that you can kind of always rely on North Korea is bad, North Koreans are in Russia, therefore Russia is bad, but not just bad, it's even worse than than you think it is. But there are two things. I think anything coming out of the mouth of Zelensky, I think, needs to be doubted. I think it needs to be disbelieved. And I think in the media, any statement around North Korea from the mainstream media also should be treated with extreme caution and skepticism, because it always turns out to be completely wrong. And I, challenge anybody to show me an allegation that has turned out to be correct about North Korea. But we have gone over this before. North Korea, the allegation is that North Korea has been, for example, supplying shells to Russia. Well, Russia doesn't need North Korean shells because it makes its own. But let's take that hypothetical. What's the proof? Well, the proof is that shipping containers have been going to Russia. Now, if you know anything about a shipping container is not designed to move heavy shells. So if you were putting heavy shells inside a shipping container, it would be 90 to 95% empty, which is an incredibly inefficient way of transporting material in time of war. It's like, why would you spend 90% of your time transporting air to the front? That's absolutely ridiculous. And then, they say they found fragments of a missile that is North Korean. Well, it's not. It's absolutely ridiculous. You have one character which looks like a Korean character, but it could just as easily be a Japanese character. So that doesn't prove anything. The Korean character, Chiut, you would never use it by itself. It would be like finding two dots, like an umlaut, and saying, this proves that this weapon is German. No, it's not, because you don't use umlauts just by themselves. You use them with other letters. So, and other countries use umlauts as well. So that's the first piece. Secondly, they said, it had a kind of, kind of a bolt pattern, which is only North Korean. No, it's not. It's a universal bolt pattern. So that doesn't prove anything. And then they said it had certain numbers, it's like 1, 2, 3, and those numbers are meaningful in North Korea. No, they're not. It's absolute ridiculousness. But they take something which is so marginal and they try to expand it out as proof. And that is usually the extent of anything which is alleged about North Korea. It's built on no proof or the most absurd, ridiculous fragments that are extrapolated into something. But I think what it does tells us something important, and that is that the accusation is a confession. That is to say, South Korea is supplying more munitions to Ukraine than all of the EU combined. And so, clearly, South Korea is doing what what Ukrainian leadership is accusing North Korea of. And I think we just have to take it all with a pinch of salt. That isn't to say Russia and North Korea don't have good relations. They recently signed a mutual defense. They renewed a mutual defense treaty, or they upgraded it to a mutual defense treaty. So they are very, very close together. But historically, they always have been. And so, this particular factoid, we can be quite sure that it is fraudulent.
Yeah, and I think that that's definitely good to keep in mind. And especially when it comes to anything North Korea related, I know that there is a lot of moving parts here all around. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest across all of these conflicts that we have ongoing at the same time. KJ Noh, a journalist, political analyst, and co host of the China Report on Breakthrough News. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you, Rachel. Always a pleasure.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's also where you can find the latest episodes of my new weekly series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also find Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. That's where you can vote in regular polls and Q&As and join the community there. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.